Welcome to this audio commentary on the film Alfie. I'm delighted to be doing this. My name's Melanie Williams. I'm a professor of film studies at the University of East Anglia and a specialist in British cinema.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here with Melanie talking about the film, which is a real favourite of mine. I'm Jo Botting and I'm a curator at the BFI National Archive. So here we are with Alfie, looking over the River Thames at Waterloo. And I know that a little snippet here, Michael Caine was actually a member of the BFI at this time. And in fact, I happen to know that he has a library book that he never returned because we have his library card in the special collection there. So there's a little bit of a connection there for you.
What a rotter. Now,
I think we forgave him, given what happened subsequently.
And we've got some interesting kind of animal parallels at the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
And I've got a rather nice little snippet from correspondence with the BBFC, who was slightly concerned about images of dogs sniffing each other, that there might be trouble if the behaviour of the dogs was a close parallel to what was going on in the car. So already, even in its opening moments, Alfie is potentially causing some problems in terms of censorship, particularly in terms of representing sexual activity, which of course is a very strong feature of the film.
Absolutely, yeah. Albeit, very subtle now compared to what we see today, but clearly it had its issues, and of course other things it discusses, which we will be talking about later. So Michael Caine starts, as he means to go on, talking directly to us, which I think was probably quite a shock for audiences at the time. And I want to say a little bit about the font, which you just saw in the title. So that's really interesting. John Gilbert, who is Lewis Gilbert's son, who worked very closely on this film, was a good friend of Harry Pecinotti, who was the art director of a magazine called Nova. And you might recognise that font because that is the font that was used for Nova magazine, which actually came out about the same time that this film did. And Harry Pecinotti didn't design that font. He found it was like a vintage woodcut font that he had found. And so it's a really nice kind of tie-in because Nova, obviously, as you'll know, Melanie, was quite a revolutionary magazine at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really a sign of how this film is very much part of that milieu of the swinging 60s, which kind of transcends and moves across different media, from print media like Nova to obviously pop music, film, television, fashion. So Alfie is very much part of, and is very much marketed as part of this new cultural excitement around London as the swinging city, the hip metropolis.
Indeed.
And it's interesting because in some ways the film and its story and its hero are kind of more old-fashioned in his attitudes, but at the same time the film is also pointing forwards to a kind of new permissive society, the sort of sexually liberated society, while still examining its costs, I think. And that's true of lots of these swinging London films, that actually when you look at them in detail, they're not all that swinging. They're a little more ambivalent than that.
Yeah, they very much quite often end on a note in which it shows that lifestyle is not all it's cracked up to be, and you quite often get left on your own. But it's interesting what you say about it being a swinging London film, because obviously we get that wonderful sweeping shot of the Thames to start with, which just says London to all international audiences so strongly. But then you end up at St Pancras Gasworks in the back of a car. I like the way it shows many different sides of that London, and obviously it's Alfie's world. This is the world that he inhabits, and he's introducing us to it and drawing us into it. So he's dropping his girlfriend Siddy here at this is Temple Tube Station, and obviously this is Millicent Martin, who was a real 60s icon in a way.
Yeah. I mean, she'd been in Nothing But the Best a couple of years before. That was, I think, her film debut, but she's very strongly associated with the satire boom, and her appearances on That Was the Week That Was. So I think the casting of the film overall is very interesting in the way that it draws on lots of different traditions and movements in British culture around that time.
Yeah,
There's a really fascinating mix.
Yeah, because she was actually a musical star from the 50s. I mean, she had a big career, but obviously it was the TV that made her a big star. And she ended up in America being quite popular on TV in the States. So she had quite an interesting career. And playing her husband here, we've got John Cater, who is just a very popular character actor who was on a lot of movies like Loot, The Abominable Dr. Phibes. And here he's meeting her at St Margaret's Station here, which was obviously very close to Twickenham Studios, where they did a little bit of the filming. It's mainly shot on location. But the scenes inside Alfie's flat, I think, are probably the only ones that were actually done at the studio. But obviously St Margaret's is in southwest London, so that was very close to the studio.
And we've got more moments of direct address to the camera here.
Yeah.
Alfie kind of letting us into his world and his worldview. And in one interview, the director, Lewis Gilbert, talked about this being a sort of audience participation picture. This is how he envisaged the film. This idea of the audience being kind of brought into Alfie's world, feeling the kind of the pull of his life. And it is really crucial to the way that the film functions, I think, but not in a straightforward sense of identifying with the character. It's much more complex than that, I think.
Yeah, and I think, you know, he is, as you say, it is his philosophy. We're very much being told his philosophy. And actually, you know, he's painted as a misogynist. I don't read him as that at all, actually, because he's quite disparaging about all kinds of people, not just women. Obviously, his treatment of them is very much along those lines. But for me, it's like that one of the best uses of direct address in cinema. Obviously, it has been done elsewhere, but it just works so well. And obviously, the film was based on a radio play initially. It started off as a radio play on the BBC Third programme in 1962. But it was very different. The radio play was very, very different to how it's ended up here. So Bill Owen played Alfie in that, but it's told through a narrator. So the narrator is somebody he meets during the war. So obviously it's set 20 years before, begins 20 years before. And the narrator kind of meets Alfie at various points in his life. So the same events happen, but told in a very different way, sort of through the eyes. And in a sense, we become that narrator. The audience becomes that narrator because Alfie is sort of inducting the narrator into his own worldview. His Little Life, as the title goes. It was Alfie Elkins and The Little Life. So it's interesting that, you know, that role of the narrator has been given to the audience almost to sort of, you know, get involved with.
And he is presented as a kind of puzzle for us to solve in a way, because he's a very not divided character exactly, but he has many different elements, some of which are positive and sympathetic, and others which kind of take your breath away in their selfishness. And I think the question of misogyny is a really important one in relation to this film, because it does have those lines of dialogue about, you know, describing or using it to describe women rather than she, and, you know, lots of attitudes that seem kind of very mired in their moment. But I think it would be altogether too simplistic to say that the film is celebrating those or upholding them. I think it kind of is in some ways, because obviously Caine is the star, and the way that he's presented is as a kind of Jack the Lad but the consequences of some of his attitudes and behaviours are certainly examined and held up to the light.
Absolutely.
As we can see in the way that he interacts with Julia Foster's character.
Gilda, yeah.
Yeah. She's very downtrodden, isn't she? Poor soul.
Yeah, and on a sort of level of the social aspect of the movie, the moment just previously where he asked about basically whether her period had started or not, because obviously there's that cross on the colour circle on the calendar to indicate that. And actually, some of the critics pointed out this is the first time a film has ever talked about. They didn't use the word period even in their reviews, because that was not a word you used. The curse, they called it. The first time the curse has been actually mentioned in a film. And
it talks about the little friend, doesn't it? Has your friend arrived?
That's right. And actually it pops up again in, I think it's Spring and Port Wine, which is another Bill Norton, who's the author, another film based on Bill Norton, where they call it Fred, basically.
Oh, right.
The period is called Fred in that movie. So it's subtly done, but again, I think it's, it is breaking some taboos in that way, but not in an obvious way, not in a sort of offensive way. It feels to me.
I mean, looking at some of the correspondence with the BBFC, that was certainly one of the things that they were a little troubled by. So they expressed some uncertainty around what they call the explicit references to menstruation, and say they may pass, but you should provide for the possibility that they may not. So it's clearly a kind of still quite an edgy thing to be able to even allude to through euphemism.
Yeah. And of course, that kind of thing in the theatre, for example, because this then went on to be a stage play, would have been much easier to get through, because theatre was considered obviously something that only the elite went to, and then it was much less, troubling to senses generally. But so yeah, that's really interesting. Obviously, later on there are more serious subjects which it covers, which we can talk about when they come up. So we've got Julia Foster here on the bus with Graham Stark, who obviously was also extremely well known. Another sort of great 50s and 60s character, really, due to his association with Peter Sellers, and he helped out on The Goons occasionally, did a show called Fred, things like that. Again, very much in the sort of satire and comedy vein as well.
And here he's kind of in the film he functions as the sort of anti-Alfie, doesn't he? In that he is responsible, he is willing to step up, and his relationship with Gilda is very kind of sweet and sincere, and by the end you're wondering who the real kind of winners and losers are in this whole thing. Whereas at this stage, I think his character Humphrey is sort of presented as a bit of a sad sack loser, but perhaps the tables are turned, as you say, by the end.
He, as you say, he's reliable and loving and responsible and does the right thing, but he's not sexy. He's not appealing at all in that sense. So it is very much about what, for a woman long term, what are the qualities you need to be looking for, and actually it's interesting because we don't know very much about Humphrey in this. But he does have quite a backstory in some of the other versions of this. So I think in the novel, he was married with a child and they get killed by a concrete lorry or something. So there are sort of various different elements to the characters that you don't get so much in the film. And I think that was the right decision, because you don't want to crowd it with too much kind of backstory. So in the play, his wife had left him and took their child away. And as I said in the novel, his story is that he witnessed his wife and child being killed by a cement lorry. So again, even with Alfie, you don't get any kind of sense really of his backstory. Again, which does come out in some of the other versions. So he talks about his childhood in the novel. And in the radio play as well, I think. So his mother died when he was very young, and his father remarried, but he never got on with his stepmother. So I think that comes out in some of the conversations later on. He kind of alludes to it, but never really talks directly about his own history.
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's not a film that uses flashback, even though it does have some sequences that kind of take us out of a more realist form of presentation. So later on, we'll get some kind of freeze frames and different approaches to filming that idea of kind of personal memory. But unlike, say, I don't know, the Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, where we do have the backstory of the character filled in through flashback, here it's very much about being in the present moment, really, with Alfie, and the immediacy of that kind of direct address to us.
Yeah, because, as I said, the title of the play is In His Little Life. We are being, we're drawn into that. And I'd tell you that any kind of flashback, I think, would have detracted from that. Or I think it would have weakened the film's strength, actually, which is us going on a journey with him, if you like, because he does learn a lot along the way. And you do see that in the episodic structure of the radio play, where he sort of works through the different things that happen to him, and his philosophy kind of refines, as he goes through, because it's very much, money's important, and then he gets ill, and health is important, and then it's, he ends up at a different place by the end of the film. So it's subtle, it's very subtle, and as you say, but we are kind of invited to invest in him, because although some of the things he says and does are fairly repugnant, he's not a bad person. I think that's what is so good about the way that his performance and the writing, everything that goes into the film works so well.
Just to sort of go off on a bit of a tangent, Michael Caine's shirt in that sequence, I think, is quite interesting, because when we first see the character, he's wearing quite sort of traditional clothes, the sort of blazer with the crest on. This feels a bit more kind of like an older style of dress that perhaps relates to the like you say, the post-war origins of the character. But in that last scene, we see him wearing a shirt that looks a bit more like a kind of Ben Sherman kind of, and the mac and the narrow lapels and the thin ties seem more like Italian tailoring. So even in Alfie's costuming, there's a really interesting mixture of like slightly old-fashioned elements and then stuff that feels a little more like kind of contemporary mod male fashion. Yeah. And I think it tells us a little bit about this film's sort of interesting in-between status. It's not part of the British New Wave, which is more strongly associated with black and white production and with northern stories. It's a London story and it's filmed in colour. But at the same time, it's not completely in the kind of swinging milieu that would dominate British cinema a couple of years later. So it's kind of occupies this in-between position of being realist but comic and in colour at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, Gilbert had some interesting things to say about choosing colour. He talked about the choice that they've made and said, we're shooting it in colour because, after all, life is in colour. There's an idea that because you have a low subject, anything about a Cockney man, it's got to be in black and white. But because he's a Cockney, he doesn't go around in black and white glasses. He lives in a colourful world, really. And I think it is very interesting to think about those aesthetic choices.
Can I just interject?
Yeah,
here
go
quickly?
ahead.
Sorry, because the lady in the dry cleaners is a really interesting character of the 60s. Again, this is Pauline Boty, one of the founders of the pop art movement, believe it or not, and the only woman who was part of British pop art. She hung out with David Hockney and Peter Blake, and she was actually a regular dancer on Ready, Steady, Go as well. She had quite an amazing career. And she was actually pregnant when this film was shot. She became pregnant by her husband, but she was actually having an affair with Philip Saville at the time. But she developed cancer while she was pregnant and died just not long after she had the baby. So she died just after the film came out, actually. So she's a really fascinating character, and it's really interesting that she's there just in that tiny cameo of the film. And in fact, the story of Darling is allegedly based on her life. So there's so many just interesting people in the film, and I'll just talk very quickly about this lady in the car now, because this is Des O'Connor's wife, Gillian Vaughan, and apparently this shoot caused a bit of marital problem because he was away at the time touring, and thought she was gone off with somebody else because she got the job at the last minute and was not home when he was ringing her. So Caine tells this story, and this, of course, is Virginia Weatherall, who was, again, a big actress, married to Ralph Bates, appeared in Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, Demons of the Mind, and she's literally in for seconds. So it's just amazing that the people that were brought together for this film, even in tiny roles. And again, as you say, that's such a 60s movie, so many sort of important figures, particularly the female casting.
Yeah, it's such a cavalcade of, different elements of that sort of mid-1960s culture, I think, drawing on television and music and art, and a really good barometer of how exciting and vibrant British popular culture was around this point, which, of course, is one of the reasons why Paramount, and along with lots of other British studios, invest in British production, that idea that Alexander Walker talks about of Hollywood England, that suddenly Britain and particularly London is seen as a sort of epicenter of, if you want to make an exciting, appealing film, go to London to do it. And so many films kind of come out of that Hollywood investment in British production. From the Beatles films through to Tom Jones, through to the Bond films, through to films like Alfie. Of course, one of the problems later on is what happens when that American investment evaporates, when the 60s are no longer deemed to be swinging in London. But this is very much that kind of initial heyday of seeing London as a sort of great place to set and make a movie.
And actually, this is the film that Lewis Gilbert's son John, who I sort of met through work, and I chatted to about the film. This was really when he came into his own. He'd worked with his father. He was 25, I think, in the mid-60s when this was made. So he had worked with his father quite a lot on various films in a second assistant director, that kind of thing. And associate producer on various films in the late 50s. But this was really his moment, because Lewis Gilbert was 45 by now. He was not a young man. He was not on the scene. But John Gilbert in his mid-20s, he really was. He knew Michael Caine. He knew lots of people. He knew Harry Petronotti at Nova. He knew a lot of the real swinging London figures. So he really had a massive input to this film. In terms of the casting and the music. He brought Sonny Rollins on to do the music. So he really had such a massive input to the film. And I think a lot of its success is down to that. He was working at this time on and off for a company called Signal Films, which was run by Douglas Rankin, which was mainly a commercial company. And actually quite a lot of the crew came on board from Signal Films. So he brought a lot of the people on board that he'd had experience of working with. So it was quite a different kind of proposition to possibly the way Lewis Gilbert had worked before.
And when you look at Lewis Gilbert's filmography as well, that it makes a lot of sense that he was had a way of tapping into a kind of younger generation's tastes and interests, because this is very far from the Sea Shall Not Have Them or Carve Her Name with Pride or Albert R. Wren or some of those earlier films that Gilbert directed. This does feel much more in a sort of 60s register.
Yeah, I mean, he did do The Good Die Young, which I think is obviously 10 years earlier, but at the same time, it has that kind of gritty London feel to it, which I think you does come across a little bit as well. So I think he was actually a very incredibly versatile director, and then he'd go on to do things like, Educating Rita, which, watching this, you might not imagine him to be the kind of film that would interest him, but he's he had an amazing career, really.
And one of those sort of those figures in British cinema who make lots of really important films that have a really big audience at the time, but that don't have shelves of books written about them, and it's a pity, really, because Gilbert's career is fascinating, and there's a lot of quality and interest within that. So at this point in the film, we've kind of moved from the kind of carefree moment of Alfie getting to know his young son, and a kind of montage that makes use of freeze frame and color desaturation and slow motion, and it's quite arty in a way, this moment of kind of familial connection, whereas Alfie is generally quite a kind of disconnected, selfish person, immediately followed by this moment of medical anxiety where he gets an X-ray, he gets tested, and will hear some bad news as a result.
Yeah, it's interesting. Of course, we didn't sort of mention the fact, obviously, that Gilda fell pregnant, which again was probably the first moment when reality kind of hits him, in a sense, and it's like, having kids was just completely alien to him and something he would never have contemplated, but it's happened, and in his favor, he doesn't try to dissuade her from having a child, and so that's the first big sort of change in his life. It's the consequences of his actions, come to fruition, and he, surprising to himself, he really forms a bond with his son. Who's incidentally the toddler Malcolm is played by the son of Lewis Gilbert's assistant, who he had for many, many years, and so that's who that is. But yes, as you say, and then of course the next thing that hits him is his own frailty, I guess, in terms of his health. So
because it's a kind of dent to his masculine pride in a way, isn't it? And this whole narrative is going to be about a series of challenges to Alfie's sense of himself and his masculinity, I suppose, and how to be a man in the contemporary world he inhabits. Just a quick word about the mise en scène. One of the things that happens recurrently in Alfie is that return to the riverside, to the canal side, the kind of waterways and people walking along them or standing by them. It is a kind of recurrent feature of the mise en scène of the film. And it's interesting because it, like you were saying at the beginning, Joe, it's in some ways the film uses the London iconography that we're more familiar with, and then in other ways it's showing us the kind of less familiar, more working class version of the London docks and canals and the banks of the Thames. So it's kind of presenting us with different ideas of what London looks like. It's not just the kind of obvious landmark London. It's little moments like this as well.
Yeah, this is St Mary's Church in Battersea, and behind you can see Lots Road Power Station on the other side of the road. But yeah, you're right. That's one of its real strengths, and I know Gilbert was very, very keen that it should be, shot very much on location. Obviously, this is one of the few studio shots at Twickenham, and this is a really interesting scene because Alfie's quoting a poem by Leigh Hunt, Ben Arben, which is really interesting in terms of what we were talking about, his philosophy. You know, obviously he's well read. You know, he's not an ignorant person. He's got a lot more to him than you might initially imagine. So the poem was written in 1838, and just after the little bit that he quotes, that there's a line that says, "Write me as one who loves his fellow men," which was Leigh Hunt's epitaph. And I think that's you could say that about Alfie. You know, he does love his fellow men. You know, he sees their flaws and he points them out. But I think deep down he genuinely does care about people, even though the way he treats them doesn't always, that doesn't always come across in the way that we might, measure it.
Yeah, it's quite touching, that little moment with his son.
Yeah. And go on.
Well, I suppose the way the film sort of turns on an emotional sixpence quite often, so he'll pivot from being a really kind of empathetic figure to immediately behaving like a heel, as he is here with Gilda, poor put upon Gilda.
Yeah.
And it's almost like the two sides are kind of directly informing each other, that they're kind of like the yin and yang of his personality. You don't get the sweetness without him kind of almost reproaching himself for his sweetness and immediately behaving like a pig as some kind of counterbalance.
Yeah. Julia Foster, of course, was another real 60s chick in a sense. I mean, she had some amazing parts during this period, such as she was in The Small World of Sammy Lee, which was, of course, another play adapted for film. And she has the biggest, obviously, female role in the film. And it's just, I mean, she's amazing in it. She's really brilliant.
Because she still has a bit of spirit and fight, even though everything is kind of counting against her in a way. She's not a doormat. She's a character who's trying to find some self-determination in life.
Yeah, she knows what she wants, and she's very moral and very honest. You know, Alfie tries to persuade her to, steal a bit out of the till at the cafe, and she as much as she loves him, she's not prepared to compromise her own ideals and morals for him. And there's a line in this conversation they've just had, which is really where you get a tiny window into Alfie's childhood, where he kind of says that, we all need proper fathers and proper mothers. It seems there's just not enough to go around these days. And that's really the only kind of insight that you really get to his possible, unhappy childhood.
There's that interesting moment as well, where it almost looks as though she's about to look to the camera.
Yeah.
Which is the usually just the privilege of Caine's character, not granted to anyone else.
But then again, that scene cuts to this one where he's, the swagger's back, and as you say, he's got the natty suits. But this scene with the doctor, I think, is one of the most interesting in the whole film. Because it really flips the direct address, because up until now we've had him having a conversation and doing occasional asides to us. But in this, the whole conversation is with us, with occasional asides to Eleanor Bron's character, the doctor, which is, and it's so beautifully choreographed and acted as well by both of them.
It doesn't feel like it's kind of Brechtian experimentalism, although, managing the difficult demands of continuing two conversations simultaneously in a dramatic scene is actually, to do that and not in an avant-garde film is really smart, I think.
Absolutely. And it is just so well done. Obviously Eleanor Bron, another fabulous 60s chick, who had done Help, I think, just before this. Of course. And she, again, as you say, it must have been quite a tough scene to act and to film as well. And of course, the editing is, really, really tight too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bron also having that connection to the satire movement, being connected with all those like Oxbridge comedians and Footlights and all of that. So it's another sort of cultural current that's flowing into this film.
Yeah.
And I think she's the only one who has a significant scene with him who is not one of his romantic conquests.
Yeah.
Even though there's a bit of a frisson in the scene, but it doesn't kind of come to anything.
But I think I think all his interactions with women, pretty much, he's trying to create that frisson, and she seems to be fairly impervious to it. She's really the only one who is. But he starts to open up to her as well, which is really fascinating, because he's confiding in us to a degree, but he doesn't really. He certainly doesn't open up to women generally. So the fact that he starts to talk about his son and things is quite... and again, she's very much taken aback by his confidence in her.
There's some very nice like little looks to camera as well, whilst carrying on a conversation with another character in the scene. It's very deft the way it's handled, I think.
I mean, I can't imagine another actor in this role at all. And I know, as I said, John Gilbert was friends with Michael Caine at the time. Lewis Gilbert didn't really know him, but Caine had just finished the Ipcress file, which hadn't yet been released. And I think what happened was John Gilbert arranged for Peter Hunt, I think was the editor, who arranged for Lewis Gilbert to come and see it literally as he was cutting it, to see Caine's performance. And that kind of convinced him, his performance as Harry Palmer in the Ipcress file convinced Lewis Gilbert that he could take the role. So really, I mean, the Ipcress file was his big breakthrough, really, his first sort of leading role. And it's really interesting to see how he's excellent in the Ipcress file, but it's quite it's partly the character as well, but it's quite a muted performance in a lot of ways, and it's a beautifully shot film. It's fabulous of its type. It's kind of the anti, de-glamorized Bond. He's a spy, but it's all very downbeat, and there's no bikinis. But Gilbert obviously saw that he could take the role of Alfie. And it's a role I know that Michael Caine had wanted to play, was very keen.
Because his flatmate, Terence Stamp, had been in the stage production.
Yeah,
that was right.
I think there was talk. I mean, there was various different casting ideas along the way, because I think at one point Lawrence Harvey was discussed. But as I said, I just don't... He would have been too old. I mean, interestingly... Yeah. The stage production had John Neville in the role. Now, John Neville, and it was then later taken over by Michael Medwin, were both in their early 40s, or just 40, I think. So they were a good 10 years older than Michael Caine. And I think that would have brought a very different aspect to it. Michael Caine, I think, is exactly the right age. And as you say, Terence Stamp did the show on Broadway, and it closed after... something like 21 performances. I mean, it didn't do well at all on Broadway. So that kind of ended Terence Stamp's bid, I think, to be in the movie.
I did read somewhere about Anthony Newley being in the frame as well, and I can envisage that working given, his TV work on Gurney Slade and that idea of
and Sammy
breaking,
Lee, of course, as well.
Yeah, but that idea of breaking the kind of breaking the wall and speaking back. And it was Bill Owen in the original radio version,
yes.
So Compo from Last of the Summer Wine, which just but of course has a completely different vibe.
But of course, bearing in mind that character was, that was set in the 40s. So again, it had quite a different feel to it. I mean, he was a spivvy kind of character in the 40s, working through over quite a long period of time. But yeah, Bill Owen was cast in the original radio play. So yeah, and again, it was much more a downbeat kind of character, I think, at that point. But it's very much, that character in the play, you were talking about clothes, and the character in the play was very spivvy and very interested in his clothes. He would turn up to do his war work in his suede shoes and things. That was very much an emphasis of that. You don't get that so much in this version of it, but it comes out very much. I don't know if you've watched the remake with Jude Law from 2004.
Yes, the metrosexual outfit.
And he's talking about Prada and Gucci, and it was very much an element of
there's still that hint of him being fastidious with having the handkerchief so that his suit doesn't get messed up.
Very much. And he says, "Don't ruffle my sleeve" and things. But he doesn't talk about the brands. There's not that kind of obsession with tailored stuff. He doesn't really talk about that aspect of it. But interestingly, that would bring it closer to James Bond as well, because that idea of Ian Fleming's style of constantly invoking different brands as a way of saying something about the character's exquisite tastes. It's interesting that there's that link, because clearly across different genres and different types of film, there's this real interest in the 1960s in this kind of the womanizer figure, and that we've got that in Tom Jones as the kind of historical variant on that. Yes. We've got that in Alfie, and we've got that through things like the Bond films as well. They're all very interested in these kind of sexually promiscuous, confident young men. And you can even look back to Pal Joey. It's sort of that there's that element that's you can trace back even to there. But yeah, it's and interestingly, the sort of promotional images certainly for the play had John Neville surrounded by all these women, very much like the Tom Jones posters. So that was very much a way of promoting it. So Alfie's ill now, obviously, and he's in this sanatorium. So this is again in Twickenham, so near the studios.
And this is quite a crucial turning point for the character. This period of enforced rest. But not necessarily self-examination. That kind of comes a bit later on. But it's interesting to see him as lifted from his usual milieu and placed in this entirely new setting.
Yeah.
Building new relationships as a result.
It's actually filmed at York House in Twickenham, and obviously his chief relationship he forms here is with Harry Clammercroft, who we see here, played by Alfie Bass, who was a real East End Russian Jewish immigrant. His parents came over from Russia, and he was a Shakespearean actor. He was, obviously very distinguished in his own way. And he's, again, as you say, this is a real turning point in lots of ways for Alfie, the relationship he developed. And in the novel is actually a very, very good. The novel came out the same year as the film, I think. So Bill Norton, the author, was working on various different iterations of the same story. But the novel's a really good read, I have to say. And as I said, it obviously has a lot more backstory. But in the novel, there are a lot more characters, and I think in the play as well, the stage play, there are a lot more characters that you meet in the sanatorium. A lot of sort of city chaps, suits who commute into the city for work, and Alfie spends a lot of time kind of dissing their values and their way of life. But the relationship he develops with Harry is really interesting and very endearing, actually.
And he's one of the characters who kind of speaks back to Alfie as well, and suggests some of the limitations of his way of seeing the world.
Yeah,
the kind of entirely selfish viewpoint.
Very much so, because Alfie is clearly very disparaging about marriage and everything that goes with it. So it is, but as you say, there's sort of sobering moments further into their relationship. And obviously we've now introduced Vivian Merchant, who was the only person who won an award for her performance in this film. I think she won a BAFTA.
Yes, she did. Yeah, a BAFTA Most Promising Newcomer to Leading Film.
Yeah,
roles.
Because she'd been an actress for a long time, but this was her first film role. Interesting. She was born Ada Thompson, and she formed the name Vivian Merchant from Vivian Lee and the fact that her brother was a merchant seaman. Michael Caine had worked with her previously in the Pinter play, The Room, at the Royal Court in 1960. So Michael Caine claims that he got her onto the film. John Gilbert says that he knew her well as an actress and wanted her. And she actually had quite a sexy on-stage kind of persona. But John Gilbert said it was amazing when she first turned up to film this scene in the flat later on, and she completely transformed herself from quite a glamorous woman to just through her own makeup and dress and the way she sat and the way she held herself. She transformed herself into this more dowdy character.
Can I just jump in with an aside about the banana that Alfie Bass is eating?
Do.
Because this was one of the other things that came up in BBFC correspondence around the film. They said, I do not know whether the choice of a banana in this scene is intended to have any visual significance or not. Since it might possibly give this impression, I suggest you might well substitute an apple or something of this kind. But obviously the banana stayed in the scene. Good. So there's a kind of a little whiff of carry-on, I think.
Yeah, nice very much.
Moment of fruity innuendo while Michael Caine is on the other side of the curtain with Shirley Ann Field.
Indeed.
I think.
And again, another fabulous 60s actress who she'd been a Beat Girl, Peeping Tom in 1960. It was a good year for her, and Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, of course. And John Gilbert had met her because he was the second assistant editor on Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. And she kind of rang him when the film was in pre-production and said, any chance of a part? So she got the role of the nurse in this. And she's perfect for it.
I mean, it's quite a small role considering she was... sort of developing quite a career.
Well,
at that point.
I gather at that point she wasn't being offered many parts, but she does have a slightly bigger scene later on with Caine, which is quite an interesting scene where he does kind of open up to her a little bit. But I think at this point she'd done The Damned in 1963, but I think her career had slowed down a little bit by that point. So yeah, here's her other scene with him. Where he reveals his dream, which again is something that does appear in other versions of the story.
It's probably worth saying something about the sort of TB sanatorium as a sort of setting and an engine for creativity. I mean, we think of the sort of 19th century and early 20th century stories like Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, and heroines expiring glamorously from TB in things like La Bohème. But also that enforced seclusion and leisure becomes an interesting sort of way of incubating certain creative acts. So, for instance, the writing team, Galton and Simpson, first meet each other and kind of get together as a creative team because they're both in the same sanatorium as teenagers. And Alan Sillitoe, who, of course, wrote Saturday Night and Sunday Morning that Shirley Ann Field appears in the film adaptation of, his writing career really kind of gains momentum through a period of recuperation from TB. So the sort of centrality of TB, even as late as the 1950s and 1960s, I think is really fascinating, because we might associate it more with the past, but it's still a problem here for this character, and it still kind of makes sense for this to be the way that he's taken out of his usual urban context and placed somewhere else.
Yeah, and in the novel, there's a fascinating little bit where he just says, "I'll never forget that first night in the sanatorium. My pillow was all wet with tears. I turned my face into it so no one could hear me, and I sobbed my little heart out." And again, you certainly don't get those kind of moments or insights in the movie. Although you might infer his feelings at certain moments, but the novel's much more explicit about him being in touch with his feelings, I guess, if you like.
Yeah, that Caine's performance doesn't have that element, even though other performances he gives in other films, do have him breaking down into tears.
Well, of course he does. We do see him actually shed a tear later on, don't we?
Later on, yes.
But as you say, for me, this is another really key scene. This particular one. I mean, I don't think the film would work as well if he did show more emotion. I think, in imparting his philosophy, there has to be that sort of slight detachment.
Yeah, well, he's a man trying to convince himself a lot of the time, isn't he? It's all about putting on a front. That's part of what masculinity is all about, pretending that you're kind of confident and robust and in charge when this might not be the case.
This is one of the few moments, really, where he has a conversation with a man. I mean, you see him interact with women a lot, and that's why it's so interesting. But I just love the interaction between the two of them, because he goes on and on, poor Harry, about, if you died, you'd forget about you. And actually they talk about, they'd stop coming to your grave after a few months. They'd forget who you were. And I think it's in the novel, it says, it's got a wonderful image of, like, your grave will be full of dead flowers and a broken Woolworths vase. And it's just conjures up, it's so recognizable in its illusions. So but as you say, Harry does give him a bit of a wake up moment towards the end of this scene, when he says, Alfie says, "I never wanted to hurt you, Harry. I never wanted to hurt anybody." And we believe that. But Harry says, "No, I suppose not. But you do, Alfie. You do." And that feels like a real sort of turning point in the film.
Yeah, it's a crucial sort of staging post, isn't it, in that emotional journey that the film embarks upon. But I think there's also, we often see Michael Caine not only talking to us quite confidently as the audience, but also talking quite loudly and quite confidently. He's often kind of pointing the finger and it sort of says something about this growth of working class confidence, I suppose, in the 1960s, that there's nothing, there's no kind of, not modesty exactly, but it's that sense of wanting to occupy space and to be not worried about being loud. And of course, that's crucial to Michael Caine's whole persona. This is really the thing that impersonators latch onto when they're pretending to be Michael Caine. It's really the Michael Caine of Alfie that begins all of that.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, we Murray Melvin's appeared already, but we didn't talk about him much. I mean, this was the film, I think, for Murray that really, made him recognisable. And that hat had a big part of it, because obviously that's a actual designer hat that they went down.
That's a great hat.
Savile Row Taylor had made, or I don't know who exactly, but of course the Beatles then ended up wearing them before this came out, and he was a bit pissed off about that because he wanted to be the first one to model it. But Murray had worked with Lewis Gilbert before. I was lucky enough to chat to Murray about his recollections about the film, and he had worked with Lewis Gilbert before, but he was very much taken aback. He got taken out to tea with Lewis Gilbert and his wife Hilda, who he was very friendly with. And he was handed the script, and he just thought, I am so the wrong actor for this role. It's lovely to be asked, thank you, but what am I doing being Caine's friend? You need someone a bit more heavy. But Lewis said, I know you will come up with something. Murray had obviously worked with Joan Littlewood at Stratford East, so he was an actor who was very much used to coming up with something, if you like, because her way of working was always demanded something new. So he was very happy to be in it, and I think he makes it work. I think, although he might not be the type you'd expect to be Alfie's friend, and he did tell me that he'd sort of created a backstory in his mind, for the part. So, in his mind, they were born next door to each other, him and Alfie. They went to school together, and their lives kind of took different paths, but they've always known each other. And again, his character, Nat, which actually isn't in the play, it's sort of divided amongst other people in the other versions of it, but it really comes to the surface here. He's really Alfie's only confidant, and obviously that you can see that long-term friendship in the way they interact and the way they are with each other, the casualness and the understanding, I think, is always there.
And at this point, Alfie's kind of taken a tip from Nat to become a street photographer, hasn't he?
And apparently this scene was improvised. A lot of the interaction with the extras walking up and down was pretty much improvised, Murray told me. But obviously it introduces a very important character, that of Ruby, played by Shelley Winters, who's quite a different piece of casting for the film. And I gather she was a little bit of a diva to work with. She was, she'd quite often arrive late on set. People were waiting around for her quite a lot. And she decided she'd like to be paid for with a Rolls Royce, and then changed her mind. And she was quite she was quite difficult to work with. And I gather that Michael Caine says this in his autobiography, that she would leave glasses of water around the set, and he picked one up one time to have a drink, and it wasn't water. It was something a lot stronger. So but again, I think, in the other versions, Ruby is a Cockney made good kind of, East End character who's, a widow whose husband's died and left her a lot of money. Making her American is quite a departure, but I think it kind of works.
Well, it's interesting to think about that in the context of the sort of production finance, isn't it? The idea of a kind of American who's loaded with money bestowing her favours upon this sort of, cheeky, charismatic Englishman. Kind of, it's rather a nice metaphor for how the film's being made in the first place.
Yeah, that is a very good point. So he's now obviously offered Harry's wife a lift home and thought he'd cheer her up a bit, and decide she's not quite as bad looking as he originally thought, very kindly. So maybe talk a little bit about Bill Norton very quickly. And Bill Norton, who wrote the original play, was born in Bolton, and he has been very much celebrated in Bolton. It was his centenary 10 years ago. And actually the radio play was repeated by the BBC in 2010, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, because you can't imagine a 1962 TV programme ever being repeated in prime time. It just goes to show how versatile radio can be. But he had a very successful career, and he's now sort of very much, lauded. Alfie came to the stage because Norton was writing for a TV series called Nathaniel Titlar in the mid-50s, in which Bernard Miles played a country bumpkin. And then, of course, Bernard Miles, a couple of years later, started The Mermaid, so that's how their association came about. And I think we alluded to the fact that this is one of 3 films based on Bill Norton's work. So the other 2 are very much set in the north of England, and built around that kind of atmosphere. So that's The Family Way and Spring and Port Wine. So The Family Way was 66, I think, and Spring and Port Wine was 1970. Both set in Bolton. And although the films are very different, I think they have a kind of they have a connection in that they're very much about the male role model and the expected behaviour of men. Here he's Lothario. In the other 2 films, it's about patriarchy. But through the film, the frailties behind those kind of postures are very much come out. So you get John Mills and James Mason in the other two movies playing these familial patriarchs who have these moments of self-doubt, as Alfie will do.
And there's an element of sort of generation gap in those as well, that I think you get a little bit in Alfie, but it's not quite so clearly demarcated. But the difference in sort of more traditional attitudes to marriage and sex, and then the different way of thinking about those things that Alfie appears to represent. And all 3 films are interesting as well in having something of the quality of the early 60s realist films that focus on working class life, particularly on male protagonists, but then being filmed in colour. And I think they really sort of close the gap between what's happening at the beginning of 60s cinema and how it develops from the kind of midpoint onwards. They're kind of perfectly poised between, and they're all very popular films as well. They're all successful and get an audience.
Yeah, very much so. So here we have Jane Asher introduced into the film. Obviously, she was, again, another very much a key figure in the 60s, because at this point in time, she was actually Paul McCartney's girlfriend, which, makes her, again, ideal casting. And as you say, Mel, brings her into this whole cultural melange that the film is bringing in. And this is the Busy Bee Cafe, which is just outside Watford, which is rather wonderful. Again, we're out of London now, interestingly, and but also, but it's quite a fascinating setting, I think, and obviously Alfie appearing in his chauffeur's uniform while all his mates are truck driving. And actually interesting, there is a sequel to this movie called Alfie Darling, made in 75, I think, in which Alfie has become a truck driver, a Geordie truck driver, in fact.
Quite a transformation.
Yeah, played by Alan Price. And I'm afraid to say it's not a great movie. It was produced by Douglas Rankin, who I think I mentioned before ran Signal Films, which was the commercial company that Lewis's son John worked for. And he produced Alfie Darling, which was based on the Bill Norton's novel, sequel novel. And it's quite a hard watch. It's more like a confessions film, actually. It's sort of gone a bit too far that way, I think.
Yeah, I suppose it tells you something about the sort of shift in British cinema culture between the high 60s and the high 70s. And
very much so. I mean, it's a real 70s movie, and Alan Price is not great casting, and it's kind of seedy in a sense. I mean, one of the characters describes him as having no finesse, and that's really just sums it up. And he does do a bit of direct address in that film, but not until nearly half an hour into it, and it just doesn't work because it's not sustained in the way that it is here.
Jane Asher's character is interesting as a northerner, and she's one of those examples of the sort of 60s girl who comes to London to seek her fortune. So the same as Rita Tushingham in The Knack, which had been made the previous year. Also, again, Rita Tushingham and Lynn Redgrave in Smashing Time, a similar sort of geographical journey for a sort of swinging 60s chick travelling from the north back down to the south. And probably the sort of point of origin for this is in Billy Liar, where Julie Christie's character, Liz, who's a bit of a wanderer, catches the train to London, whereas Billy, Tom Courtenay's character, stays in his northern hometown. So although Alfie is sort of very much London focused in a way, there's still this interesting north-south division or interaction that's present in the film.
Yeah, and actually, interestingly, this character who is called Annie started off in a different play by Bill Norton, a TV play actually called Somewhere for the Night, which Michael Caine had appeared in. It was part of the Sunday night play, a BBC series broadcast in March '61. And this is the character in this particular play. It's a young Irish girl who arrives in London to find her sister living with a group of spivs. And that obviously the origin is different here. She's northern, but it's very much that aspect of a young woman arriving in the capital. And the character, I think, is very similar, and you'll see her develop, as she goes along. She's obviously in love with somebody else and spends all her time cleaning and cooking, and that's very much like the character in this particular earlier play that Bill Norton wrote. So here she's being whisked away here by Alfie, away from a truck driver played by Sidney Taffler. Now, Sidney Taffler was in every Lewis Gilbert film there was, because Lewis Gilbert married his sister Hilda. so it was obligatory for him to be cast in everything he did, which is fair enough. He's a great actor. No complaints there.
And he often plays sort of slightly spivvy characters, doesn't he? So it's interesting that, Alfie has his origins as a sort of spivvy type, and Sidney Taffler, one of the great British cinema spivvy types is in the film, but playing a different kind of character in this case.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, he's older, but he's still, he's still trying to get the girl. I mean, he was a Shakespearean actor as well. I mean, he had his more legitimate side, if you like. But this is one joke that I think John Gilbert told me, that if his mother would have murdered Lewis if he hadn't cast him in every film, and even if he needed a nun, they'd cast Sidney Taffler in the role just to get him in there. So that's a nice family connection.
There's some lovely colour production design, I think, that's worth flagging up. The very judicious, careful use of red accents in the sort of mise en scène of the flat. It's really beautifully and carefully done.
It is very much so, and as you mentioned the costumes before, and clearly the way that the different women in his life dress as well is very much tied into that and carefully coordinated with with the set design. And obviously, as we said earlier, this is one of the few studio scenes in the film. And it's clearly a sort of key. A lot of the key scenes, happen in this space. And again, this Annie here is a very different kind of woman to the ones that he's come in contact with before. And again, this another aspect of his life that sort of changes him, because she's not enamored of Alfie, she's in love with somebody else.
And he finds that very difficult to cope with, that she kind of has silent moments where she's clearly thinking about somebody else, and this really infuriates him.
Yeah, it sort of does, but he never. I mean, he doesn't get angry really, Alfie, does he? He might get slightly agitated, but he's not. He doesn't. His showing of emotion is mostly very muted.
Yes.
So it's kind of an annoyance rather than anything more than that, isn't it?
He's not an angry young man, is he? To sort of refer back to that 1950s male type that is one of the engines for this great change in British theatre and British literature and British cinema, that Alfie is one of the outputs of, I think. But he's not a kind of angry type, is he, in the way that Jimmy Porter, the anti-hero of Look Back in Anger, is.
It's interesting though, because some of the critics did actually compare him to some of those figures, and I can kind of understand that sort of reference. But yeah, as you say, he's kind of moved on. But Caine remarks that when he met Bill Norton, he had imagined that he would be a young swinging guy, to write this kind of story. But of course, the whole point about Alfie is that he is kind of, the philosophy he's developed is something that you develop over your life. It was almost like, I think Bill Norton was in his mid-50s at this point. It's sort of something you can only really develop when you've lived a life and reflecting back on it. So it's quite, coming from the mouth of Michael Caine, he's clearly very thoughtful. He's thought out these things a great deal. They're not just off the cuff.
No, interesting to sort of compare it to something like Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, where, we get that opening narration where Arthur Seaton, played by Albert Finney, sets out his worldview. And, it's a really amazing introduction to the character and to the film. And this is a kind of extension of that process, that idea of being directly talked to by the character who tells you how they look at the world and, how they see things.
Yeah, very much. I mean, of course, direct address had been quite common in early cinema. At the very beginning of the 20th century, it was quite normal for characters to be looking at the camera in early cinema, and it's something that has been used in so many different ways over the years. You get comedies like Hell's a Poppin' and the road movies quite often use that kind of direct address. So comedy was its natural home, really. But films like High Fidelity, which also uses it, and I think in a slightly similar way to the way it's used here, in that the guy's sort of sharing his life and his thoughts about his life. Although not quite as effectively, I don't think. But
do you think, do we have to mention Fleabag as well in this context as a
absolutely.
a very modern take on that idea?
Yeah. And a woman, of course. We don't often get to have a woman discussing her. So this flat, I just need to mention, this is Lionel Blair's flat, where Ruby lives. And it was in a block in Notting Hill. Obviously, it's been dressed by the art director, as you say, who's I think it's interesting because she's got lots of sort of continental knickknacks. she's got lots of Spanish bullfighter posters
and a Tretyakov painting and a sort of gong.
Absolutely.
All sorts.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. And Peter Mullins was the art director, and he again was one of the technicians who'd worked at Signal Films, the commercial company that John Gilbert had worked for. And as I said, John brought on board quite a lot of these people, and it was, obviously commercials were a great place for a lot of people to start, in terms of directors as well, and because that's where the money was. There was a lot of money sloshing around to make commercials, and then obviously most, wanted to graduate into feature film direction, and quite a few did in terms of this film. And Peter Mullins went on to do 5 of the Pink Panther films, Death Wish 3, Shanghai Surprise. He had a very long feature film career. But this flat is rather fascinating. I mean, in some ways, it might have suited a sort of aspirational East End bird more than an American.
It's a bit of a forerunner to sort of Abigail's Party, sort of tacky suburban chic, isn't it?
Very tasteless.
I think the BBFC
absolutely.
were also concerned with this scene about how low cut and how diaphanous Shelley Winter's negligee would be. So there's some stern notices about making sure it's not too revealing.
Yes. I think Caine. I think I think at one point her corset, one of her corset bones came out and stabbed Michael Caine. He says in his autobiography. But I think there's a few stories in there that might be a bit anecdotal, but it's.
So breaking off there to sort of talk us through what's happening.
Yeah, it's there's the I think, like I mentioned, we were talking about the remake Alfie in 2004, and that they do the direct address in that, and it works reasonably well actually. But at one moment he does it while he's having sex with somebody, and I think that's a bit rude. I don't know. I think you might want to. And obviously here it's all kept behind closed doors, and that's kind of what we want. But this is interesting because he's clearly thinking, and he's got it made now, that he's happy to settle down with Ruby,
who he keeps telling us is in beautiful condition, like she's a car. It's really telling way of describing her.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, here we are, Queenie Watts, wonderful, again a fabulous East End character, and there's a wonderful documentary called Portrait of Queenie. As Sydney Tapper again appeared. Portrait of Queenie, which you can watch on YouTube, which is well worth a watch if you're interested, because she actually ran her own pub in Poplar in the East End, and she was a real character, and she was a pub singer obviously too. And this was shot in the Black Horse pub in Brixton in South London, which is just very near where I used to live. And so it's a big pub with a room at the back. So again, it's all location stuff. It's now a building society. Sadly, it's not a pub anymore.
Oh, Queenie Watts is she in Poor Cow as well? She's Carol White's.
I don't know.
Isn't she
might be.
auntie that she goes to live with?
She might well be. Yeah.
I mean, she's certainly kind of around. Again, one of these examples of someone who's really interesting 60s figure who kind of turns up in these different films. And
she's certainly in Sparrows Can't Sing. And she was just a real character, apparently, and John Gilbert remembered her as really welcoming and warm, and again, an amazing character. It's really worth watching that little documentary to find out more about her. But she's belting out her songs all through this scene, which is
so
great.
They're really trying to maintain a strong sense of authentic London atmosphere in the film, aren't they? Even though Paramount are, providing the financial support, there's still that desire to make sure it doesn't become some transatlantic mush, and that it does kind of keep a bit of authenticity about its depiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I gather from John Gilbert that the budget wasn't massive. I mean, to Paramount, it wasn't a huge amount of money, so they didn't get massively involved, with the production itself. And I think they were a little bit surprised when they saw the result. But it was kind of done by then, so it was like we may as well, we might as well put it out and see what happens. But I'm not sure they're expecting that much from it. It was quite long delayed in America. It didn't get released straight away. I think they were a little bit concerned about how it was going to go down for various reasons. But it did pretty well, I think, in the end.
It does very well on its British release, doesn't it? It's looking at the Kinney Weekly end of year listings, it's second only to Thunderball, the James Bond film, on general release. Obviously you had things like The Sound of Music and Dr. Zhivago as these kind of roadshow mega presentations that were being shown at the same time. But it's a big box office hit in Britain. Also, wins prizes, wins the Prix de Jury at Cannes, and so it's a kind of popular and critical success, I think, which is quite an achievement.
And the premiere happened in Leicester Square just at the time that the election was building up. So this was the election at the end of March 1966 when Harold Wilson, became Labour Prime Minister, up against Ted Heath. And apparently part of the promotional, this again was John Gilbert's idea, part of the promotional thing was there was a lot of political activity going on in Leicester Square, and he had these sandwich boards made up saying, vote for Alfie. People were walking around advertising that. And the premiere was a massive, massive do. John Gilbert really wanted to make it a rock star premiere, so Paul McCartney was obviously there because Jane Asher, the Beatles, and the Stones were there, and they had a massive party in a downstairs room in a pub. Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers were there playing their version of the McCartney song "Gotta Get You Into My Life." So that was it was a real event, and I think I certainly Murray Melvin remembered it as really an amazing occasion. So again, this all added, I think, to its swinging 60s credentials.
Although this is more like something from the Wild West, isn't it, this fight scene?
Well, it's the obligatory pub fight scene. I mean, it really reminds me, actually, of the pub fight scene in Sparrows Can't Sing.
Yes. A big good old-fashioned dust-up in a pub.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've got to have that. It's it's obligatory. So he's coming home to poor Annie. He's still scrubbing the floors. And it's again, he's sort of torn here between Annie and Ruby are obviously very different.
And he's worried here that he's pontified, isn't he? That's what he says, that he's
That's
puffed
right.
out.
He's getting all bloated from the hot pots.
Too much northern cooking.
I love those turn of phrase, those words like pontified that he and his mates use. I think it's wonderful. And some of the names that Bill Norton comes up with as well, like Harry Clammercroft, they're almost Dickensian in their kind of, weirdness. It's a very interesting turn of phrase. And the way he talks is very, very much personalised, and his character comes through very much through that.
The thing that strikes me about this scene and some others like it is that they're not afraid to make Alfie, really repugnant. That they're not always like jonesing for us to love him and like him in spite of everything. They are willing to see him kind of take it out on different people who are kind of vulnerable in some way. He's never just a simple hero or anti-hero. It's always a very nuanced balance of the two.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, you know, we can kind of feel his frustration because she is moping around quite a bit. You know, she doesn't want to go anywhere. She doesn't want to do much. In a way, he's doing her a favour because, you know, the best thing for her is to get out. And I think he, you know, we talked earlier about the misogyny, and clearly, you know, he doesn't treat women particularly well. But then he doesn't treat anybody particularly well, really. And there's a you know, just to indicate the sort of balance of how, you know, his views on people. There's a wonderful line in the novel that he says, a woman told me she once went paralysed down one side of her face, forcing herself to laugh at her old man's jokes, what she'd heard 2 million times. So it's very much, you know, the recognition that men, you know, can be just as bad in their own ways, and women have to put up with a lot. And he does say women put up with a lot.
Well, he sees himself as providing a sort of social service, doesn't he? Because he cheers up, you know, miserable housewives, so they can go back to their husbands much happier.
And at one point in the novel, he says, you know, if men had periods, then we'd be in a right old state.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know how women cope with doing that every month. You know, it's he's got his. You know,
moments of insight.
You do kind of go along with him, I think. Yeah, absolutely. But I think you do go along with that. You can kind of see his point of view. And the fact that he does have his own, you know, moment of realisation, you're able to stay with him, I think.
Oh, another red bus. Now, I think it was Alan Parker that said, you know, whenever you saw a red bus in a British film, you knew you were in for a rotten time. Because it exemplified all that was dreadful about 60s British cinema. But I think there are so many fantastic films with red buses in. I mean, the Ipcress File has got red buses in. This has a red bus in. Plenty of films do it. I think it's outright prejudice against British films of this era, because they haven't always had a very easy critical ride. I mean, at the time they might have been praised, but subsequently they've been kind of dismissed as more trivial, too wrapped up in fashion. But I think that's a bit unfair to some of the remarkable films that come out of this period in Britain.
I think that's really true, and I think a lot of it's in the writing. I mean, you look at something. I mean, Darling is just such a fantastic film, and it's kind of, you know, I think we said earlier, it's very much that darker side of the 60s. You know, she makes her way to the top, but all she finds is loneliness and madness almost. You know, it's that sort of aspiration, or the, you know, whatever it is that's driving young people, is shown to be not all it's cracked up to be. Basically.
Well, an acknowledgement of the heavy penalty that women pay for moments of pleasure, which of course is what this part of the film is all about.
Absolutely. And of course this was one of the big things that caused problems with the American release, because you weren't even allowed to use the word abortion in American films at this time. And actually they don't use the word, but it's quite clear what's happening. I don't think they use the word anyway directly.
So we've got Denham Elliott playing a very
fantastic,
sort of seedy character.
Yeah, it's what a performance though. And Caine, you know, acknowledges in his autobiography that Denham Elliott acted him off the screen, and again, it's the film is made up of these wonderful little scenes where actors are really given the chance to shine. And I think Elliott's performance in this suggests, in just this short scene, a character with a very complex story behind him. Almost, and it reminds me a little bit of the character in The Deep Blue Sea, who's the doctor neighbour of the main character, has a very dark and sort of, he's been struck off and very dark and seedy past. And Denham Elliott, you know, who's a very prolific actor, had led a bit of double life. I mean, he was bisexual, he died of AIDS. And I think, you know, he encapsulates so much in this performance of you know, that sort of sense of a complex character.
Because he's both sort of merciful in this. He's a helper, but he's also, you know, very far from being a heroic figure.
Absolutely, he's businesslike almost, isn't he? I mean, it's quite. It makes them very uncomfortable because they can't quite understand his attitude. But really, you know, this scene, he steals this scene. I think I mean, although of course Vivian Merchant did win an award for her performance, and I think that this scene is probably a large part contributes largely to that. And I think this is the moment that John Gilbert was talking about, where she suddenly appears very, very dowdy and very introverted, and it's such a beautiful.
Well, and it's
scene.
so beautifully composed as well. The sort of blocking and the positioning of the actors, and the very subtle
and the
camera movement.
The rain on the windows.
It's worth saying Otto Haller, brilliant cinematographer, you know,
Indeed.
with an amazing track record in British films, was
he'd been
nominated for BAFTA for his work on this film. But it's very skillful, very subtle work.
Yeah. I mean, he'd been in the business since the 30s, and he was nearly 70, I think, when he shot shot Alfie, and he died 4 years later, sadly. He's again, as you know, as we were saying, it's really just this coming together of real pool of talent. And I mentioned the music earlier. Sonny Rollins obviously did the soundtrack, and again, that was somebody that John Gilbert was a big fan of. He was a big jazz fan. And so they took Lewis Gilbert down to Ronnie Scott's. And he had the reputation of being quite difficult to work with, but he just literally sort of extemporized the
And it's a fantastic score. It's, you know, it's brilliant.
It is amazing. And again, it's such an important part of the film. It really sort of sets the mood so well right from the opening shot. And then, of course, you got the theme song, Alfie, which was, I think, originally on the British release, was sung by Cilla Black, but that this version has the Cher version of the song.
And Millicent Martin did a version as well, didn't she? So.
Yeah, but I've not heard that one. I don't know where that appeared from. But so John Gilbert was sent to New York to meet Burt Bacharach and Hal David to get them to write the song. And very cleverly, they kind of took the last line of the movie and sort of made that the main theme of the song, which is great. But John Gilbert remembered going to go and hear the song, and Burt Bacharach played it for him on the piano. So they asked various singers. Sandy Shaw was approached to sing it, but she turned it down. So he went to see Cilla Black, who was doing Panto in Wimbledon, and she agreed. And then obviously I think Paramount presumably wanted the Cher version, preferred an American version for their release. John Gilbert wasn't that keen on that. He liked the song, but he didn't feel that it really fitted the movie. And I think if he'd had his choice, he would have just had the Sonny Rollins score at the end of the movie. But obviously it was a hit. Cilla recorded it at Abbey Road with George Martin and a 48-piece orchestra. And it went to number 9 in the chart. The Cher version only got to 37 in the States. So it's a bit of a shame that we can't hear that version here, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of time and effort went into all those things, and obviously you had some great musicians playing on the Sonny Rollins score. Got Ronnie Scott on sax, so it was a real, a jazz musician's kind of treat, really.
This scene, I mean, it's certainly the most controversial aspect of Alfie, the abortion, and it's the way I think that the film sort of speaks to the sort of social climate of the time most powerfully. And of course there have been kind of references to this within Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, in Darling as well. and also in the television play Up the Junction, which would also be adapted for the screen, and the problem of abortion being illegal, and so backstreet abortions being the only option open to women seeking to terminate a pregnancy. And the film, I don't think kind of takes a particular position on this, but it certainly shows us the kind of the horror of the situation in a way that is, very, very harrowing.
Yeah, and Alfie, is expecting it to be a 5-minute procedure with no pain or distress involved, and he's clearly really taken aback by how she is. And I mean, he does hit her, and it's a shocking moment, but at the same time, clearly he's right. If she makes a noise and someone calls the police, then they're all going to be in trouble. Of course, the year after the film came out, 1967, the abortion bill brought. Well, I don't know if it brought an end to backstreet abortions, but it made abortion legal. So you do wonder whether films like this had any kind of effect on that legislation. Alfie's walking through Brixton at the moment, along by the railway track in Brixton, South London. And again, this is a very interesting scene. As you say, look, we're back by the water, as you pointed out earlier, as sort of a location that's used.
It's quite contemplative, isn't it? And we're back at the church that we were visiting earlier in the film, I think.
That's right, yeah. It's quite a coincidence, really. He happens to turn up at this moment, but I mean, I think we'll allow that bit of artistic license. But clearly, he sees Malcolm and gets a glimpse of what he could have had.
But just as he tells Alfie Bass's character, you'll be forgotten. As soon as you leave the scene, they'll move on and they won't care about you. That's exactly what he sees kind of visited upon himself. They've moved on.
And actually, in the novel, he's in the church and Malcolm wanders around the church and sees him and doesn't recognise him, which it doesn't actually happen here, because I think the time scale, the time stretch is quite compressed for the movie. Obviously, a year must have passed because she's had a baby, but you don't get much of a sense of the passing of time, particularly in this film. His journey, through his various stages of his life happens quite quickly.
This shot of Caine hiding behind a pillar is so interesting because most of the time he's, centre stage. He's completely confident in commanding our attention and speaking directly to us as our sort of, guide through his world. And instead here we see him kind of skulking out of sight and trying not to be seen. So it's a real sort of change in the presentation of that character. He becomes quiet, contemplative, hidden, rather than kind of upfront and confident.
And actually, it's sort of that actual shot of him there leaning against the pillar was very reminiscent of his kind of image in something like the Ipcress File. It's quite a different sort of, as you say, different aspect of him. So he's obviously seeing the results of what happened, and as you say, this is a moment where he has to recognise and accept the results of his lifestyle, basically.
And Vivian Merchant is brilliant. She's so broken and weary and guilty in these scenes. Brilliant performance from her.
Yeah, it's and again, this is another really key moment for Alfie, and beautifully played by Caine, because you know, as you say, we've just had that scene of him looking contemplative. So he's just come back from seeing, you know, his son completely taken away from him, and now this, and
his shock at realizing that the aborted fetus is a baby, that he wasn't anticipating that, and is shocked and horrified by that, and
people, I mean, Caine claims that people said, "Oh, yeah, when you see that fetus," but of course you don't see the fetus. But I think the way he plays the scene, you feel like you are seeing it almost. You are imagining it, and it's done so slowly and so just really effectively that you sort of do, because you're immersed in his world, you sort of do, you know, go along with it.
Unsurprisingly, this is something that the filmmakers had to tread very carefully in terms of censorship. So the BBFC advised, you know, these could be very moving scenes. Obviously, we shall not see what Alfie sees. So that sense of the importance of discretion. But you know, they also say these are strong scenes, but they will probably be acceptable in the context. So they are willing to engage with very challenging material for a mainstream film, as long as it's dealt with sensitively.
Yeah. So now we see his friend Nat's flat, and this was somewhere near South Kensington, I seem to remember. And he felt very strongly that he didn't want to be just standing still during the scene, which is why he decided he was going to tend his flowers on the balcony and actually, you know, show Nat in his natural environment, if you like.
It's that,
and again, you know, this is a rare occasion of Alfie confiding in someone and opening up, and to a man as well, which again was quite.
Yeah, I think Nat's role is really interesting in the film, because obviously Alfie is he's a confidant. You know, he confesses to us, but also to have this additional character who will listen to him.
Yeah, very much so. And again, as you mentioned, they're down by the canals. Now I think this is St Pancras again. So the film was sort of reappraised at various moments, actually, after its release. So the Independent on Sunday, the newspaper, reassessed its sexual politics in 2001 and sort of felt that it had aged well and actually grown in significance, is what they say. And they spoke to some of the people involved with it. But the author of the article says that the moral that there is no ultimate satisfaction without a human relationship to go along with it found a sympathetic audience in neglected wives and discarded girlfriends everywhere, which I think is quite offensive, actually.
I don't know. I mean, is it that it shows the hollowness of being a kind of Jack the Lad, Don Juan sort of figure, that this isn't the way to happiness. The way to happiness is to settle down and live a good life. Implicitly, it's quite a traditional moral message.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you say, I think quite a lot of the swinging 60s movies do have that. You know, the party was over, really, by 66, I think. You know, that initial moment that started in 63, it didn't last, you know, the innocence, I suppose, didn't last all that long.
No, I mean, when you look at the films from that moment, it's very difficult to find one that really fits the template of being completely swinging. They're all a little unsure or ambivalent or...
Yeah. I mean, even some of the sex films, like the first narrative sex film, Her Private Hell, directed by Norman Warren, that has a very dark side of that whole lifestyle. And then the sequel to that, well, his next film, Norman Warren did, was Loving Feeling, which is about this hip DJ who's got women chasing him down the street, and he can have any woman he wants. But he is married, and he loses his wife through his behaviour and ends up lonely and sad. And again, even in that kind of film, which is, you'd think
Yeah.
might try
Be
and,
upbeat about, sexual
I mean, this was
liberation.
67 again, so it was later even in the decade. But I think, as you say, people do, might not regard those films as particularly interesting on a sort of commentary level, but that it is all there, if you look for it. So again, this is really Alfie's key moment coming up.
So he's decided that he's going to stick with Ruby, Shelley Winter's character.
He's brought flowers. This is a big development for him. He's back at Lionel Blair's
He's got his
place.
blazer back on with the crest.
He's got which is, I think, what's really interesting about this scene. So in the play, it's actually one of his mates who she's having an affair with. So again, that was quite drastically changed, and clearly the transistor radio. There's little clues here that it's an even younger generation than him who's now in vogue with Ruby.
And there's a little bit of like bedroom farce, isn't there, about what's behind closed doors and trying to make excuses. We've sort of moved into a slightly different generic context.
Yeah, which and obviously at this point, up until now, he's been the center. His knowledge has been the center of the film. Clearly now he's in a situation where there's something he doesn't know, which does change the tone, I think, a little bit.
It's got comeuppance written all over it, hasn't it, really?
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think, the thing that is really wounding to his pride when he does find out that Ruby's got another boyfriend on the go is that he's a younger type, isn't he? He's kind of a long hair. He's more 60s than Alfie. He's been superseded by a whole new kind of desirable young man.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously I mentioned the transistor radio, now the guitar. This is like, he's a musician. He's a long-haired musician. And what I find really interesting about this, as you say, he's got his blazer back on, but he looks old or older than he did. There's the wind's taken out of his sails to some degree, and he does. I actually just see him in a very different light. He does suddenly look old, and it's that realization.
Yeah, how long can you carry on doing this kind of thing without being a bit sad?
Yeah, absolutely. The chances he's missed along the way to, he had a devoted girlfriend in Gilda who would have, happily married him and settled down, but he wasn't ready for that, and now he is, and it's too late. It's I
mean, this scene's very different in tone from the previous ones, but it's interesting how they both hinge on things that are hidden behind a door, behind a curtain, that are then kind of revealed to Alfie, and he is shocked by them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's his undoing is coming quite thick and fast.
And Ruby has kind of bested him, which is a complete turnaround from the usual gender dynamic.
And it is that line she has, he's younger than you. Simple as that.
Jog on. That's
absolutely.
a rather nice, interesting gesture, isn't it? Leaving her with one of the flowers and then dumping the rest in the river.
Absolutely. But this is again a nice thing about the film, this circular structure. So we're back where we started from at the beginning of the movie, which I really like. So we're on the embankment by the river. And a
lovely bit of twilight filming, isn't it? Is it twilight or is it early morning? I'm not sure.
I'm assuming it's twilight because I would imagine he would have gone round.
Yeah.
I'm imagining this is straight after the scene we've just seen. So evening time.
So we're really back where we began, aren't we? With by the riverside. telling us about, how he sees the world. But things have shifted a bit by now, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So he bumps into...
Yeah, Siddy from the beginning.
I just mentioned very briefly the editing. The editor was a woman, Thelma Connell, who was nominated for a British Academy Award for her work on this film. And again, I think the editing is a really key element of the movie, especially in some of the scenes that we've discussed when he's talking to camera and talking to characters as well. It must have been quite a tough job.
She's a terrific editor, very, very sharp. And of course, editing is a field where women did marginally better, in film production than.
Yeah, I mean, she was training during the war. She helped out on The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, so she obviously had a good background training in it. But no, again, it's interesting. We're back in the same place and we're back with the same character. Who saw him
and she's not keen anymore, is she?
No, she gives him the brush off, which is interesting because in the play, she says, "All right, I'll come and have a drink with you," and actually she does go with him. So that change has altered the tone, obviously at the ending, a great deal, and leaves you with quite a different feeling.
Is this the beginning of continual rejection? That's 2 in a row now. So you can see why he's reassessing his life choices at this point.
Yeah, and he is left with kind of nothing, but except he's got self-realization, and I think he does say, all through the film he's talked about money being important, health being important, but peace of mind now is what he's lacking, and his conclusion of this whole philosophy is that's your peace of mind is the most important thing.
I think Caine is wonderful at these moments. I know he later did acting masterclasses and would talk about how to have a steady gaze and not to look uncomfortable on the screen, and you can really see that he's already developed those skills quite early in his career about how to command the screen effectively.
I gather he did actually have somebody standing just behind the camera, just to the side of the camera, because he found it difficult to look directly at the camera. That's what a couple of people who worked on it have told me, that there would have been someone for his eye line in a way. But
and he's got the dog back. Yeah, and that's nice.
I know. Yeah, again, this is reinforcing the whole circular nature of the film. We literally end where we started, and then we come into this fabulous closing credit sequence. It's
brilliant, isn't it?
Was shot by reportage photographer the very well-known photographer Vic Singh, who again was a friend of John Gilbert, and he was out on set taking these sort of impromptu photos of all the cast, which are fabulous, but also you get to see the crew,
which is really great because you get pictures of people that are very hard to see otherwise, even in the trade press.
Right. And also, but also to see them at work, sort of caught off guard in a sense, and it's just such a brilliant ending. And again, all credit to John Gilbert, because I think he was very key in bringing a lot of this to the screen and making it and actually the remake copied this ending with the reportage photos. The 2004 remake copied this style of the closing credits, and they even put in a photograph of Michael Caine just to remind you what you were missing in Jude Law's performance, which I thought was maybe a little bit ill-advised. But it's just, and again we got the font, the Nova, on the nose, in terms of its currentness, the wonderful font. Yeah, fabulous. So it's just, and again, I think the song works quite well. It's obviously the Cher version, as I said.
I mean, I know Cilla Black always talks about not being keen on singing a song to someone called Alfie because it sounded to her more like a dog's name. But I mean, it's one of those, very iconic, although the word is overused, 60s songs that really sums up an iconic 60s film.
Yeah. What a great place to end. So it's been such a pleasure talking about this movie with you.
And with you, Jo.
Yeah. So I hope everybody's enjoyed listening to it.
Me too.